From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Cardiology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA Cardiology.
Welcome to this podcast from JAMA Cardiology, and welcome to all of our listeners from around the world. This is Bob Bonow speaking. I'm the professor of medicine at Northwestern University and editor-in-chief of JAMA Cardiology. And I am truly delighted today to be speaking with Dr. Roxana Mehran. You're professor of cardiology and medicine and population health at Mount Sinai. You run the interventional cardiology research program, also clinical trials, and also director of women's health and vascular disease at Mount Sinai. And most importantly, you're a good friend and also a past associate editor at JAMA Cardiology. And we truly miss you, but we know you had to drop off because you inherited another full-time job as vice president of the American College of Cardiology. Welcome back to JAMA Cardiology, Roxana.
Thank you, Dr. Bonow. Bob, it's just so wonderful to be with you. I'm thrilled to be talking about this article.
Yeah, so we really want to get into this really important article that you and your notable co-authors are publishing. It's a special communication addressing how one preserves and promotes clinical trial representativeness. You've been passionate about this for years, a leader in the field. What drove you and your colleagues to determine that now is a good time to remind us about the importance of having clinical trials that address the populations we see with cardiovascular disease?
Well, thank you for that really important and critical question. As clinical trialists, as clinician scientists, and as those who care for patients, it is really, really important that our science is implemented in practice with our patients that we are treating. As such, our clinical trials should represent and be inclusive of all patients, especially representative of the disease that we are studying with regard to its prevalence in the population of patients that we're studying, so that the results of those trials could then be implemented on patient care and hopefully continue this really important goal of reducing the burden of cardiovascular disease and improving human health. And in order to do that, our trials have to be inclusive and representative. The reason why we felt that it was important to talk about that is because over the years, there have been many different purviews in underlining the importance of this. And there's been some confusion, I think, in the clinical scientific realm, whether or not we need to be inclusive anymore. And I do believe wholeheartedly that clinical scientists, clinicians, trialists are completely devoted to be sure that the work they're doing, the questions they're answering, is answering the questions for all people. And of course, this is literally the purview of any clinician as we take the Hippocratic Oath. So we want to be inclusive to all. And I do believe that even with the new directives, Bob, that trial inclusiveness doesn't go away, and promoting and preserving that, I think, will still be very important to all of us.
Well, you do get into some of the background in your article about how well we are doing, how well we could be doing. And there's some data indicating that despite the well-known recognition of this issue and the problems surrounding it, we still aren't doing a very good job in terms of enrolling individuals and also having a structure in place, not only for enrollment, but also for trial design and accountability. Clinical trialists have been trying to do this for years, and yet the data would suggest that we're still falling short, not only in terms of sex representation, but also race, ethnicity, social demographics, social determinants of health, and so forth. So your article does address some of the new directives, but I agree with you that I think as physicians and also as researchers, we want to have data that helps us manage and treat all of the patients we see. And so your article gets into some pretty specific ideas and recommendations about how one could do that. Perhaps you could step us through some of those thoughts about how we can do a better job.
I think it's really important. It's like anything else. We all have these great, huge societal objectives, and often they're really difficult to bring to fruition unless we break it down into parts that could be managed. And I think that's one of the big things that we need to think about, even from the trial design and the construct of a trial, depending on the disease state, is thinking about the prevalence in the populations. And really being more inclusive might have to do with really thinking about those exclusion and inclusion criteria as clinical trialists in the design phase of the trial to be sure that we are doing our very best to be inclusive. So that's one of the first things that I think is incredibly important. And then digging deeper into the prevalence of a specific condition of the question that we have in our studies, and better understanding that in the different regions, whether it's within this country or around the globe, what is the prevalence of that specific condition that we are looking at for different sexes, as well as, of course, better understanding that how does it impact the different populations, and to be sure that we are taking that into account and designing a study that doesn't exclude anyone, and working hard to make sure that that happens. As we go on with understanding that and working through that, one of the biggest piece of this is in how do we then, once we design, how do we think about patient recruitment, and can we engage the community of patients, especially those who we know have been difficult to enroll in clinical trials historically, under marginalized groups, really thinking about the social determinants of health and understanding where those patients live and how we could reach out to those communities to make sure that at least we can engage those leaders in those communities and to gain the trust of some of those patients to make sure that they would be at the very least understanding that such a trial, such an important question that could be a disease process in their communities is taking place, and that there's opportunities to have and to be included in the trial. And then importantly, I think, is in the recruitment time is to better understand the trial recruitment personnel and the group that are working within the research team to also be sure that they're looking out for these populations, that there is very important language barriers taken care of and health literacy, depending on what kinds of patients and what level of education you're talking about. And you can just go on and on about these little details that maybe previously we weren't paying that much attention to. It literally takes a village, and I think all of us need to be very much part of this very important piece. And then monitoring how things are going and being very close to the recruiting sites and working with them and making sure that they not only have the support, but that we have enough funding to support those kinds of added needs for a clinical trial to be sure that we could enroll and be inclusive of all populations. Now, with the digital platforms, there's a great capacity to be able to reach out to larger groups of patients. We can also think about travel costs and those kinds of things that are difficult for certain population of patients, and to be sure that we're thinking about pretty much every little detail to make sure that we're designing a trial that's inclusive in its design, but it's also in its implementation during recruitment, but most importantly during retention, because that's also a very, very important piece. And then once we have trial results, we need to also have a very good communication plan to educate all of the medical community, but also our patients with regard, especially if there's a treatment effect, a benefit, or even a harm. I think it's very, very important to be sure that we are reporting that in a very good way and keeping the patients also in the mix.
You also get into some of the specific mechanisms, how one could design trials, but also design trial leadership, so that the leadership of the trial, both at the leadership centrally, but also at the site level, where the individual investigators and the trial leadership are also kind of representative of the population. That's going to help with enrollment and also help with perhaps some of the analyses that follow. The other point that I saw as important take-homes was something you mentioned already, and that is getting community engagement and patient awareness, so that maybe we need to have more community representatives in our steering committees, even patient representatives in steering committees to help for purposes of trust and awareness of the populations that are being targeted. These are really important things. Do you have any examples yet where these things actually do lead to more effective trials?
Yes, there are actually several trials that I'm involved in, one in specifically that there is a complete separate executive steering committee for trial representativeness. And those have a lot of attention to these important intangibles that often are overlooked in several clinical trials. We've been able to, with that steering committee, making note of what is really, really important to think about with regard to whether it's language or health literacy or sex and, of course, race inclusion, to make sure that we are really paying attention in terms of how we're addressing and approaching patients, and then communicating that with trial principal investigators. And then even in the design element, having patients on steering committees actually helps us to make sure that our endpoints are very close to what patients are looking for. And we know all of that as well. That's part of the patient-centered piece. And they have a lot of great ideas, especially with regard to trust. Anytime you say, well, this is an investigational device or a drug, a patient is worried and may not trust the people. And it's a very, very important piece to translate to our patients. And I think this is yet another area that we're paying a lot of attention to, gaining the trust of the people by having patient representatives actually be part of the recruitment of the patients at the sites. It's a whole new way of thinking about this, and I think it has been quite successful in certain communities.
We're relying more and more now on industry. You also point out that of all of the clinical trials we do in cardiovascular disease, only a small percentage are actually coming from NIH or other federal agencies. So is industry up to speed with this right now? And do the industry leaders understand the importance of having a representative population in trials?
I think they're most interested because I believe that they also feel like with all of the new therapies, that they stand to gain the most benefit from some of these populations. So in some ways, it's a true win-win. Not only do they accomplish their goals in terms of child recruitment that is inclusive, but they also could gain the benefit of the point estimates that could be in their favor. But they also know that if they are involved in a trial that is all inclusive and representative of the population, the bottom line for them is a lot more positive in terms of implementation of the device or the drug or the strategy that they are promoting. What I liked about this, and I think we really tried, was to break down the best practices for trial representativeness for our readers. And thanks to the wonderful editorial team at JAMA that helped us dissect this and bring it down to very, very few points that if we pay attention to those things, we can make some of these small changes could have massive benefit in terms of trial inclusiveness, including patient and community engagement with the kinds of things that we talked about and we point out. And I hope these readers go in there and read about some of those ideas and examples and the ways that we could really do this, as well as for trialists to think about their design first and foremost, but importantly, how they would be reporting their data, standardizing those data, and being accountable and having the metrics up front of the population of patients and how they'll make sure that their trial is representative of that. And that's a really important part when we're running clinical trials. And then, of course, at the end, educating and mentoring and making sure that you spread the word of harm or benefit to everyone, not only those who've been included in the trial, but also the community of physicians, clinicians, and patients who are waiting and wanting to hear about the results of the study.
Well, Roxana, you know better than most people how clinical trials are the coin of the realm. They drive our guidelines. They drive what clinicians do. And so I think your article is going to be very important, not only for the clinical trial community, but also for all of our readers, because we do rely on having strong evidence as we try to advance the field and do better in terms of diagnosing and treating our patients. That includes all the patients we see. So I'd like to thank you and your really terrific co-authors for bringing these points to light for us. Once again, I appreciate all you've done in your own clinical trials and all you've done in your leadership.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bonow. You're an amazing leader. To all the readers listening, go back and read the article. I want us to see trial representativeness, and please spread the word. This is really important because we need to be representative of our populations. It's our calling.
Indeed. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Mehran. This episode was produced by Shelley Steffens of the JAMA Network. You can find a link to the manuscript in this episode's show notes. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.